From the mid-20th century, during a time of challenges and hopeful rebuilding, from an alliance of shared passion, Rex was born, persevering through decades, sustained by faith, emboldened by vision. Rex has become a tradition of service to the nation. With its first publications, Rex pledged itself to a more proactive role in education. As evolving education required new tools and services, so did Rex expand. In the dawn of the 21st century, when education is demanded to foster learning in all forms, learning within and beyond the walls of institutions, for sustaining today for the future. We are championing education. We are now Rex Education.
Hello everyone, welcome to the EduCampion second webinar series brought to you through a partnership between Rex Education, the Ateneo de Manila Institute for the Science and Art of Learning and Teaching, or the Ateneo SALT Institute, and the Ateneo Teacher Center. Today's webinar is the sixth of our series. My name is Galvin Ngo. I am the Assistant Director for the SALT Institute, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. The Ateneo de Manila SALT Institute seeks to promote innovations in learning and teaching, especially those that help address the challenges that the nation faces in education. In the past few years, the Ateneo Teacher Center, or the ATC, has offered summer seminar workshops for basic education teachers called Turo Guro. Recently, ATC launched a radio show called Radyo Turo Guro for teachers, which discusses teaching strategies in English, math, Filipino, science, and other education matters every weekday evening. So I hope that apart from this webinar, we can invite you to also watch those radio shows online. We are very happy to partner with Rex Education in bringing this webinar series to you. EduCampion is Rex Education's ongoing initiative for the promotion of the Filipino whole learner. EduCampion engages and empowers education duty bearers that they may better respect, protect, and fulfill every Filipino learner's right to quality education. The second EduCampion webinar series is on learner agency and is designed to build capacities for making our learners champions of their own learning. In this webinar series, we define student agency or learner agency as having the power to act. In webinars 1 and 2, we looked at the psychological basis of learner agency. Our speakers explained that students should first be able to believe in themselves. They should believe that they can achieve whatever their dreams and goals are with hard work and persistence, especially in an environment of respect and trust among teachers and students. However, we also said that this is not enough. They must also actually take the steps to make that dream come true. They must actually have the will and intention to pursue these dreams. Our speaker last week, Mr. Ryan Bolosan, discussed the importance of setting personal and academic goals, monitoring their own progress towards these goals, documenting this progress via student portfolios, and handling successes and setbacks in working for these goals. What we know is that learners must be explicitly taught strategies and tools so that they are equipped in goal setting and know how to be a lifelong learner as they journey towards these particular goals that they've set. So to add on to our knowledge about learner agency, today we will talk about a special topic on rubrics and feedback. Most of us use these as part of the assessment process, but did you know that they can be powerful tools when actually used as teaching tools? So why is this important to develop lifelong learners? We'll find out in the next few minutes as we spend our time with our guest today. Our guest today is an expert who will help in discussing this important facet of developing learner agency. Allow me to introduce her to you formally. Our guest for this morning is Ms Kara Decloedt. Sorry about that. She is the Director of Academic Affairs for Preschool to Grade 10 at Assumption College San Lorenzo. Over her career as an educator, she has served as an instructor in a rural college as a volunteer with the Associate Missionaries of the Assumption. She's also taught the International Baccalaureate or IB Visual Arts program in an international school and has worked as a curriculum writer for Dr. Grant Wiggins. She has a bachelor's degree in architecture from the University of the Philippines and a master's degree in education from the University of Florida. She is not an experienced online teacher, but she is an experienced online learner. Having taken her master's degree entirely online, she is also an avid reader, a TV series binger. Maybe later we can find out which TV series she's been binging on. An occasional painter, a frustrated cook, and a loving mom of two. So for those who are joining us today, please join me in virtually welcoming our guest speaker, Ms Kara Decloedt. Welcome, Kara.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me on your program.
Good morning, and thanks for joining us this morning. I know that it's a sacrifice to take a Saturday off to do this, but I hope that we really look forward to learning a lot from what you're about to share. So go ahead. The floor is yours. We look forward to learning a lot this morning.
Okay, thank you so much, Galvin. I'm really happy to be here. So the title of my talk is Power Tools for Teaching, Maximizing Rubrics and Feedback. And these are two topics that I'm very passionate about. Using rubrics in particular has really changed the way I practice as an educator, both as a teacher and as an administrator. And I'm really looking forward to sharing some of my learnings with you today. And thank you so much for being here. As Galvin said, it's a Saturday morning, and those are so valuable to us teachers and educators. So I will try my very best to make this worth your while. Okay, so let's just get started. Oops. There we go. Okay, so I'd like to begin by asking all the participants to look back on your own practice and think about your experiences. So first, as a student, did you ever have experiences where you got graded in ways that were mysterious to you? So I'm pretty sure the answer to this is yes. In my own experience, I remember those essays that we used to have to write in English. They were in the composition book, right? And I'd get grades that said organization, 8 points, content, 7 points, grammar, 10 points. And I just got the grades and I didn't really know how I got them, but I would see them at the end. No, maybe you also had experiences like that. I think the most mysterious one for me was in college. I had a professor. He's quite an older professor, and I got really good scores for everything, and I even got accepted from the final test. And then in the final grade, it was barely passing. So I was so mystified as to how that happened, and that one actually frustrated me a lot. So have you ever had experiences like that? Huh? The next question is, as a teacher now, have you been frustrated in your experience that many students did badly on a particular assessment? So I'm not talking about assessments where, a few students or the normal number of students performed poorly, but really assessments where half the class or more than half the class maybe failed. Has that ever happened to you? No, I know it's happened to me, so I think it's a fairly common experience. And lastly, the experience, I'd like to ask if you've had experiences where you gave students a rubric, but then when you were grading the paper, you said, binasa ba nila yung rubric? Diba? Parang hindi ko binigyan ng rubric, no? Because it just didn't seem to take. So if you've had those experiences, maybe today's talk will help you avoid them in the future or at least minimize them. So the flow of today is going to be, we'll spend a short amount of time talking about what a rubric is and why you would want to use it, though I'm sure most of you already do. And then we'll talk about the maximizing stuff. So we'll talk about maximizing rubrics for alignment to learning goals, maximizing them for clarity, and then we'll talk about maximizing feedback. Okay. So this first part is really brief. As I said, rubrics are very, very common. I'm sure most or all of you already use them, so I won't spend too much time here. But what is a rubric? It's a scoring guide, right? That helps us specify the range of criteria that we're looking for and the specific quality levels that we want in each of those criteria. Right? And generally they look like this. You're probably all familiar with it. They're usually in grid format with the descriptors laid out in order of proficiency, right? So from most proficient to least, or from least proficient to most. More importantly, why would you want to use a rubric, right? Well, one reason, and probably the most common reason, is that it helps grading be more consistent. So with the scenario that I mentioned earlier, where you might have been mystified as a student as to how you got a grade, rubrics can help that not happen, no? And not just consistency in your own class and your own grading, but it's really helpful when multiple teachers teach one subject in one level. It helps all of you grade in the same way, so that an A with one teacher is also an A with the other teacher, right? And nobody is at a disadvantage based on the teacher they get, because one has higher standards than the other. It helps you calibrate your grades. No? It also helps grading become more quick and more efficient. It helps you justify your grades, and it makes you more reflective in your practice, right? And for students, it makes expectations clear, okay? And the whole point of today's talk is this second quote, which is that students can learn from a rubric in a way that they can't from just a grade, okay? So in fact, there's this great quote that I put in here by Andrade, where she says that instructional rubrics help teachers teach as well as evaluate. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about today. She says that at their very best, rubrics are also teaching tools, right, that support student learning and the development of sophisticated learning skills. So they're not just for grading, evaluating, assessing, they are also for teaching. Okay? So how does that happen? We'll talk about that in a bit. And this is also why they're so powerful for student agency, because they're great for empowering students. Okay? So there are three kinds of rubrics. One is a holistic rubric. So I got all of these examples from a really great website called The Cult of Pedagogy by Jennifer Gonzalez. And these examples, she used breakfast in bed. So if you were going to make a rubric for breakfast in bed, this might be what it would look like, right? So in a holistic rubric, all of the indicators are placed together, right? So there are no categories. It's just you get the perfect score if you have all of this, and then it goes further down, no? So that's a holistic rubric. An analytic rubric, in contrast, breaks it up into categories, right? So she has, on the left, she has food, presentation, and comfort. And what is she looking for food? That it's perfectly cooked and seasoned, and that additional condiments are offered. Okay, presentation, it should be on a tray with napkin and silverware and decorations. And then comfort, she even tells you how she wants you to be woken up, right? Gently and lovingly. Okay, so here you have the criteria all spelled out and the descriptors for each criteria. Okay, again, in contrast to the holistic rubric, all of those criteria are in one band. So personally, I find the analytic rubric easier to use. It's a little bit more tedious to make, but I think that for the purposes of teaching with it, this is the one that I personally prefer, although holistic rubrics can be as effective as well. Okay, so most of the examples you'll see today are analytic rubrics. And then this one is less used and less known, but I think it's also very powerful, where it's the single point rubric, and it's also divided into categories, but they only specify the proficient level. And then the advanced level and the needing improvement level are narrative. So you have to say what you need improvement on in order to meet proficiency, or you write down what you did that was beyond the proficient level. Okay? All right, so we go to the meat of our talk now. I'll be giving some ideas about things that you can do with rubrics to maximize them, and I'll be phrasing them as have you ever statements. So again, I'm sure that some of you already do this, but maybe for others, they might be new ideas. And if you do them, maybe you'll have new insights into how you can do them in new ways. Okay, so first let's talk about maximizing rubrics for alignment with learning goals. And the have you ever here is, have you ever created your rubrics before designing an assessment? So usually I think the process for most of us is that we create the assessment and then we figure out, okay, how am I going to grade this? And then we write down the criteria, right? But what if you flip that and designed your rubric first? Okay, so how would you do that? By anchoring the rubric to the learning goals. So I'll be giving several examples of that now. Okay, so my first example is for grade 2 English, and I based this on the MELCs, right? So I just pulled some out of the English MELCs, and I chose writing some words, a phrase, or a sentence about an illustration or a character, and identifying and discussing the elements of a story, right? So theme, setting, characters, and events. Okay, so this is an example of how I might create a rubric based on learning goals. So if you'll notice, I have no idea yet what the task is, but I do know that whatever that task is, this should be my rubric based on my learning goals, right? So I have a criteria about describing character, right? Because that is the first, both MELCs pertain to that. So the first criteria is that you wrote a sentence or phrase that correctly describes a character and you have one or more detail, right? And then I have criteria and descriptors for setting and events, right? So for this particular rubric, I didn't include theme because I was thinking, oh, maybe that's a bit more of a difficult lesson, so I might move it to another unit or lesson, right? But that's an example of how you can create a rubric based on your learning targets. And what that does is it helps you avoid grading things that are not related to learning goals. So for example, sometimes we grade things like creativity or neatness, right? Or layout if it's a poster or something like that. But those things aren't actually related to the learning goals. So then it becomes about whether or not a child is gifted or talented at drawing, right? If she's good at drawing, swerte siya. She can get a good grade. If she's not so good, then she'll get a lower grade, or she might have somebody do her work for her, right? But that skill is not related in any way to the learning goal. So doing rubrics this way helps us avoid that practice. Okay, another example for science in grade 8. If the MELC is to have the students investigate the relationship between the amount of force applied and the mass of an object to the amount of change in the object's motion, okay, that's a handful. These might be the criteria based on that, right? Where you would have them identify the object and the forces acting on it, and then have them explain how force and mass affect the amount of change, right? So it's really directly related to the learning goal and not to something else, okay? So you could also include other categories, like maybe you have to have them diagram or model the forces, or you could have them include scientific terms, but you'd have to make sure that you're teaching them how to do all of that. Okay. You could also consider making it more general, right? Like if you feel that this one maybe gives away the answer a little bit by saying force and mass, you could make it more general, but you have to be very careful because again, you have to teach them how to do this and practice. Because if it just says that, I'm pretty sure they won't know what factors are being talked about. Okay. In college, I think I was told that we have a few higher ed participants today. So I tried to put some examples for you. I took this example from a college professor I know. So thank you to that professor. These are obviously more sophisticated. It might be for writing in a college writing class on writing a reaction paper. So you have selecting sources, contextualizing them, discussing their features and characteristics and their significance. So then you could have a rubric for each of those objectives, right? So there's a criteria for selecting the sources, contextualizing them, discussing their features and their significance. Okay, so what I've found from my personal experience is that when rubrics are designed before the assessments, it actually has forced me to create new kinds of assessments that I wasn't creating before because kailangan pala. No? I didn't realize that, oh, I have to assess this also. So a concrete example of that is when I was teaching in the IB, one of the objectives is reflection in art, reflection and evaluation about your own work. And I had never, ever, ever assessed that. But there, the rubrics are pre-made and given to you. So I suddenly had to design assessments for evaluation and reflection about their artwork. So it can take you to new frontiers in your assessment design. Okay. So this is an example of how you might design an assessment based on a rubric, right? So I've taken the English example, right? So if the rubric says that I have to describe a character and identify the setting and important events, then I can already tell that my performance task components should be those three things, right? And if you notice, I'm not thinking primarily about the format, which is sometimes where we get preoccupied, right? So we start thinking, ano, magpo-poster ba ako? Magsa-song and dance ba kami? Magsa-skit? What we're thinking of first is what are the components of the performance task that are aligned with the learning goals. So I know that I have to have them write something about the character to describe it, to describe him or her. I know that I have to have them describe and identify the setting. And I know that I have to have them name some events, right? So that becomes the core of my performance task, right? So I'm focusing more on the cognitive work rather than the format. And then I add the format later because that's what gives the task authenticity and relevance, right? And it engages the students when it's an exciting format that's related to real life, right? So maybe now I can think of the formats. Is it going to be a blurb for the back of a storybook? Is it going to be, okay, tell your family member about the story that we just read, right? Write down what you're going to read, tell him or her. Will it be a write-up for a bookstore? Will it be a book poster? Or I can even make it student's choice because again, I'm not prioritizing the format, I'm prioritizing the learning goals and gathering evidence that they can do those learning goals. Okay, so that's an example of how the rubric can help you design your assessments. Okay, so again, it can force you to create new kinds of assessments. Okay, let's try taking alignment even further, right? So we aligned rubrics to learning goals And then we aligned assessments to rubrics and therefore to learning goals. Have you ever designed learning activities that are based on your rubrics? This is also a really powerful practice that I've learned and that I really advocate because it's very powerful. Okay? This allows you to actually use the same rubric over and over again within a unit and even within a school year, right? And as students use the same rubric over and over again, they become much more adept at it. And that is one way of empowering them and giving them student agency, right? When they get to get better at using this throughout the year. Okay, so let's take that same example of that English grade 2 class, right? So we have our learning goals up here. And now I'm going to focus just on the rubric band that's about describing character. Okay, and I know that my performance task has a part where they have to write a detailed sentence to describe a character, right? And depending on the task, maybe it's the main character, maybe it's their child's favorite character, whichever one, right? So again, it's all aligned. So now I think, okay, what are the learning activities that I would need to have in order to prepare that child to succeed in meeting the top level of my rubric, okay? And I'm isolating first the part about character, okay? So maybe the first 2 days of my unit or the first 2 lessons I have will be about describing character, right? So maybe in lesson 1, my learning target is I can write a sentence to describe a character. And maybe I will start by modeling, right? Because modeling is so important so that they know how to do what you're expecting them to do. It is the I do part of the, if you heard of the graduated release of responsibility model, modeling is the I do. So the teacher can show how she describes a character, right? Maybe by annotating details. So maybe she'll underline parts in the story that show what kind of character this is. If there are illustrations, maybe she'll encircle parts of the illustration that show what kind of a character it is. And then based on what she highlighted and encircled, the teacher would then write a sentence, right? So that's modeling. And then there would be practice or formative assessment where the students then get to try it, maybe with another character. And then you could do a self-assessment with the rubric. So on day 1, you're already using the rubric to self-assess. And the children are already building familiarity with the rubric. Okay. On day 2, this is something that students sometimes have trouble with, for those of you who are English teachers, but I think even in other subjects, sometimes you get frustrated that students don't elaborate more on their answers and you want more of an explanation. So maybe it'd be good to devote a day to that, right? How do you add detail? Because if you look at your rubric, it says that the child should have included 1 or more details, right? So we are now going to teach them how to include 1 or more details in their writing. So again, that can start by modeling, where the teacher can use her description from the previous meeting and add a couple of adjectives to that, again, based on her annotations and encircling the illustrations. If students struggle with vocabulary, you could give an optional scaffold like a bank of words, right? A word bank of describing words, okay? And then again, they have their practice and formative assessment opportunities where it's their turn to add details to their description from the previous day. And then they could self-assess again. So you see that in only 2 days of the lesson, we've already used our rubric twice, not to grade, but to teach, right? And that really helps to scaffold and equip students for success. So if we do things this way, you can see that by the time they reach the performance task here, they have already used the rubric multiple times. They're so familiar with it, and they have had many opportunities to receive feedback about the way they did their work based on the rubric. So we're not just using it to grade at the very end, we're actually using it at the start of the unit continuously and repeatedly so that students gain more facility with it. And that's very empowering for them, and that's a great way to build student agency. Okay, so we have a way, I mean, we use the phrase sometimes in our school, we say tuhog lahat, diba? When it's well aligned, tuhog lahat. So that's a great analogy here, where this is one way that you can ensure alignment from your learning goals all the way down to your learning activities, right? And the rubrics are a very important tool for that. And it really helps ensure scaffolding for student success so that these rubrics are not mysterious entities. They have lots of chances to make meaning with them. And a really important question to ask is, did you teach everything that was in the rubric? One of my bosses in a school I worked at before said that one of the cardinal rules of assessment is never assess what you didn't teach, right? So that's so important. And I hope that those samples of learning activities demonstrated that you really can teach everything that you're grading, down to the adding detail, okay? So here are some additional meaning-making activities that you can do with rubrics. Of course, I mentioned self-assessment. So this is a really cute slide that I borrowed from one of our art teachers. So it is a self-assessment for grade 3. This is the kind of self-assessment that we use in our primary grades very often. It's simple, it's graphic, and it's really student-friendly. Okay. They're in the same article by Andrade, where I got the quote earlier in the talk. She suggests having students highlight words in the rubric and then highlighting where you can see that descriptor in their work. And when she described the first time she did it, she was surprised because they actually couldn't find where they did it. No? They thought they did, but they didn't. So this is a really great self-assessment activity. You can, of course, do peer assessment, where you have them use the language from the rubric. And another really great activity is having them score sample works, right? So you can give them an assessment, maybe a student work from the previous school year or something like that, so that it's anonymous, of course, and no student feels like she's put on the spot. And then have them all score it together using the rubric. So that's a great way to make meaning. And when the students do this, it's not just about the rubric, no? Because the rubrics are aligned to learning goals, what they're actually doing is talking about what makes a good work, right? If you're teaching them how to explain, then they're actually learning about, well, what makes a good explanation in real life, right? If you're talking about modeling in science, what makes a good scientific model? So it's actually a really good content lesson as well. Okay, and again, these are great ways to practice student agency. Okay, so that's it for alignment. We move on now to the next subtopic, which is maximizing the clarity of rubrics, right? So sometimes you can have rubrics that are really well aligned, but do students really understand them? Do students know exactly what you mean when you say something, when you give a descriptor? Okay? So these are some ways that you can increase the clarity of your rubric. Okay. Mainly, I'll be talking about using exemplars. Again, a practice that many of you may already do. I hope that you get some ideas from this. Okay. So this is an example of an exemplar for English, right? Where it's a response to literature. And you can see here that one of the things you can do with exemplars is annotated. Okay, sorry, this is a typo, not annotated rubrics, but annotated exemplars. No? So an exemplar is an example of work either created by a teacher or from a previous level that shows students, okay, this is what this level of the rubric looks like, right? So if you have an advanced level of the rubric, you can say this is what this looks like in terms of student work, right? And the students can study it as a sample. Okay. Again, you'll see in this particular example that the teacher has annotated it and color coded it. So if you look at the legend up here, these are the items that are in the rubric. Okay, so in the rubric, she's looking for a big idea, the theme, textual evidence, and real life connections. So she has color-coded her exemplar so that students can see exactly what each descriptor can look like. And she has also put some notes here. Okay. Of course, when using exemplars, you don't want to use the exact same problem or question or text as the performance task or summative assessment, because of course that's just giving them the answer, no? So you always want to use different texts, maybe even different contexts, right? And I would advise that you don't give the exemplar right before the big summative assessment. The best time, I think, to give the exemplar is when they're learning the skill. So day one pa lang, pwede nang ibigay yung exemplar, right? So that it's not so much, here's how you do the performance task, but here is how you do the skill. Okay. This is a really great exemplar, set of exemplars for little kids. This is by one of our art teachers, Mr. Cruz, for grade 3 art. Okay, and their project is, you see up here, they're going to do a spirit animal painting inspired by a certain artist. Okay, so these are taken from his Schoology page, since we're all online now. Okay, and he talks about how will teacher check my artwork. Okay, so he has exemplars not just for the top level, but he has exemplars for every level of his rubric, right? And he has a little video explaining it to the girls, right? So if you want to get the heart eyes emoji, you need to apply your paint carefully and consistently and cover the entire space. So you can imagine that if he had just used words, the students probably wouldn't know what that looked like or what that meant. But because they have a visual that is attached to it, they know exactly what he means. And they also know what the happy emoji means, which is his second level, where you have some white space, right? So here he encircled an example of that, right? And then the confused emoji is if you did not apply the paint carefully and you have lots and lots of white space. So he shows the students exactly what it looks like, because sometimes in their mind, they think they're already at the highest level, pero hindi pa, diba? So showing them those samples of the other levels helps them pinpoint exactly where they are. And again, this is great for student agency because when they do self and peer assessments, these are the kinds of comments that you hear. No? So I asked him, sir, what are some of the comments that they give themselves and each other? So it's things like, I need to stay inside the lines. I need to avoid too much water. Or if it's peer assessment, you need to outline it first before you paint it. Or don't leave any white spaces. Of course, they're grade 3, so they're a little bit brutal with their feedback to each other. So I would say maybe encourage them to be a little bit more gentle in their phrasing. But you can see that they are giving themselves and their peers very specific, very technical feedback that is not vague, right? And it is the rubric together with the exemplars that has enabled them to do that. So again, a great way of building student agency. Okay, so some things to think about with regard to rubrics. Okay, do I have a rubric but still actually in practice grade by comparing students' work? So what can happen sometimes is that you have some extremely gifted students in your class that are performing far above grade level. And unconsciously, the work of those students becomes the standard rather than the rubric itself. So that's why exemplars can be really valuable, because they make that your guideline rather than the work of the best student. Because sometimes you'll have, let's say, a grade 8 student who's writing at college level, or a grade 2 student who's writing at grade 6 level. So it's very unfair if their work becomes the standard that everybody else has to meet. Okay. Another question to reflect on is, do I sometimes have hidden criteria that are not explicitly stated in my rubric? So for example, in the science example that I gave earlier, the descriptor is you have a thorough and correct explanation for why there was a change in the object's motion. So that's all you're supposed to be looking for. But unconsciously, are you actually also looking for good grammar and punctuation and good English? Or is it that, do you have an unconscious bias that the longer it is, the better? And anyone who answers this in just two sentences is going to get a lower grade, right? Or are you secretly looking for 2 pieces of evidence, but you didn't put that in the descriptor, right? So those are examples of hidden criteria that are not stated in the rubric, but that we're actually looking for. So if you do have those criteria, you want to make sure that they're all spelled out really clearly, okay? And again, we never want to assess what we didn't teach. So are there skills or content in the rubric that you're expecting that you didn't teach, right? So an example of that would be here, not maybe you're saying, and you're going to say in the rubric, you gave a thorough and correct explanation for why there was a change in the object's motion, and you included scientific data in your answer. But you didn't teach them how to put scientific data in their answer, right? So then, even if they understand the concepts really well, if they don't know how to incorporate scientific data in their answer, then obviously they're not going to perform well because they didn't learn the skill that was in the rubric. Okay, so that brings me to a dilemma that is more relevant in junior high school, senior high school, and most especially in college. No? So for those college teachers that we have here and senior high teachers, this might be relevant to you, where I think that sometimes we have high expectations that the students already have certain prior knowledge or skills. For example, we might assume they already know how to put together an argument. They already know how to cite evidence. They know how to organize their thoughts into an essay. They know how to have a thesis statement, right? Rather than just putting all these statements together, they're trying to say something. We think, and we are right in thinking, that they should have learned these things already in the lower levels. But realistically, they did not always learn them, right? So in that situation, what do we do, right? Do we stick to our guns and say, okay, well, you should have learned it and it's not my job to teach it to you, so tough? Or do they need scaffolding in areas that we take for granted or that we don't actually want to teach, but they turn out to need? No? I talked to 2 college professors that I know, and this is one of their dilemmas, and they have actually found themselves teaching things that they didn't think they needed to teach anymore, right? Because it turned out that their students didn't have some of these basic skills. Another thing that I've found in practice is that, for example, in our science classes or in our art classes, we actually end up teaching the students how to write. because that is so often what we're looking for in our assessments. So if the rubric says you explained well, then we realized we have to teach them how to explain well. So writing becomes something that we teach in many subjects. And this is a challenge because of time, right? Okay, so the last topic of today is about maximizing feedback, okay? And using rubrics, as I illustrated earlier, can really help us give more effective feedback, right? Because of this process. So if you see here, students are able to try out the rubric multiple times in a unit, and that allows the teacher or their peers to give feedback many times so that the students become more adept at the skill over time. Okay. So feedback is a very important part of the assessment process, and it's been called by John Hattie as the most powerful single moderator that enhances achievement. So it really is very powerful. No? So let me just share a couple of, several good qualities of good feedback and some stems and protocols that you might be able to use in giving feedback. Okay, so the first quality of good feedback is that it's student friendly. So all of these are presented as spectrums. So as you're looking at this slide, I encourage you to try and self-assess. Where are you on this spectrum when you give feedback? No? Are you on the left darker side or on the right darker side? So language in feedbacking should be student friendly, right? It needs to be accessible. And we have to remember that students receive a lot of feedback, so we'd never want them to feel discouraged about it. So when they receive feedback from you, do they feel discouraged and frustrated? Do they feel like everything they did was wrong? Or do they feel empowered, like you saw the good as well as the areas for improvement that they need, right? Do they feel like, yes, I can do this? No? Those are things to consider. And again, all of these tips for feedback enable student agency. Okay. Is your feedback aligned with goals? No? Is it aligned with the rubric? Is it aligned with your learning goals? So when they read the feedback, do they say things like, this isn't even in the rubric, it wasn't even in the instructions, so why am I getting feedback to improve it now, right? Or, we never learned this, I have no idea, I mean, how should I have known that we had to do this? It wasn't part of our learning goals, right? Or do they see, okay, yes, this feedback is telling me how I can hit the rubric better, right? So is the feedback aligned with goals? Or minsan kasi na-OC tayo, di ba? Lahat gusto natin i-correct. So are we limiting it to feedback that is aligned with our goals? Next, is the feedback clear, specific, actionable, and again, student-friendly? So student-friendly, earlier we were talking about tone, right? And now we're talking about, can they do something about it? Right? Is it actionable for them? So when they receive the feedback, are they thinking, I don't understand what Miss or Sir means with this feedback, and I have no idea how to fix it? Or it can be, I do understand what Miss or Sir is saying, but I have no clue how to fix this, right? Or I don't understand. I mean, this is vague. I kind of get it, but medyo malabo, right? Or is that what they think when they receive the feedback? Or do they think, yes, I understand what Miss or Sir means and I know how to do this because I remember we learned this, right? Or I can see exactly what Miss is referring to and I can fix it. No? Sometimes when they don't understand, it means that they need a little bit of individualized coaching maybe, or a little bit of reteaching for a certain part, or it might mean that they need a couple of extra scaffolds to be able to revise their work there. Like maybe they need a word bank, maybe they need an extra graphic organizer or something like that so that they can reach the level that you want them to reach, right? And of course, feedback also has to be timely and ongoing. Of course, this is the biggest challenge for us because we're so pressed for time. So many of us are checking hundreds and hundreds of papers. So this is a challenge, but yes, good feedback is timely, right? So we don't want to give students feedback just after the performance task when it's too late for them to do anything. We do want to start giving them feedback right from the very start as they're beginning to learn the skills, so that by the time they get to their summative assessments and performance tasks, they've received a ton of feedback and they're so equipped, right? Also, we want to try and give feedback, when there's still time for them to do something about it, right? So if we give feedback on drafts, sana, hindi yung night before it's due, dun dadating yung feedback, no? So again, it's a challenge, but to be effective, timeliness and continuous feedback is important. One tip that you can have is, I know some teachers that code feedback, because very often you notice that you're giving the same feedback over and over and over again to multiple students because most of them make the same kinds of mistakes. So some teachers I know use a code, right? Like star means this, heart means this, triangle means this, circle means this. And that's what they write on the paper, so that they're not having to write comments on every single paper. They can just write the code and students have the legend, right? So if it's add more evidence, triangle. Elaborate on your answer more, although that's a little bit vague, so not the best example, no? But you can code your feedback. Not just the areas for improvement, but also the areas of strength, because those are also common. So that might save you some time, okay? Protocols are very powerful for being student friendly, so that even if you're in a bad mood, even if you had a bad day, even if you're tired, you still remember to affirm and cite their strengths as well as their areas for improvement. So these are for, they seem like they're for younger kids, but I can imagine even senior high or college students would be really affirmed if they got 2 stars, right? So these are very positive ways to frame not just the areas where they did well, but or also the areas where they need to improve. So you have glows and grows, you have 2 stars and a wish, you have stars and steps, and you have different formats that you can do this in. So those may be helpful for you. They're also really fantastic for self and peer assessment, right? So you can, it's not just you that can give feedback, it's also the kids and their peers. These are wonderful sentence prompts that you can use in the website where I got this. It's labeled as peer feedback prompts, but you can also use them for yourself. Again, it keeps you in check for when you might be in a bad mood or not, in the best frame of mind to check. This kind of ensures that you are being student friendly, right? So in the areas that need work, you have phrases like one suggestion would be, or you can consider changing, or I wonder if, things like that, no? And just using student friendly language can really help students feel more empowered, okay? And again, when students have rubrics and are given the chance to give each other feedback, and especially when they have exemplars, they are able to give some very high quality points for improvement, to each other and to themselves. Okay, so that's it for my presentation. I'd like to end with 2 questions that I would just like you to reflect on at the end of this. One is, what is one aha, right? One aha that you had, maybe an insight that you gained from this talk? And what is one practice that you would like to try out in your own teaching, or if you're an administrator, with your faculty? So that's it for my talk. Thank you so much for listening. Again, I know your Saturdays are so valuable, and I really hope that you gained at least a few ideas from this talk. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kyra. For those who are, so we have a good number of people, teachers who have joined us today on Facebook. The count is at 420. So we have 420 plus teachers who have spent their Saturday with you. And I hope that, I hope that much like myself, they really found a lot of engaging tips from what you presented. One takeaway that I got immediately was this is sort of like a confession, but I used to think that rubrics were really just for grades and were meant to be used at the end. But with the ideas that you presented, I think that really challenged that notion. It really made me think about, okay, so if it's not just used at the end, there are many ways pala of using them in actual teaching. No? Yeah. Sige. So there were a couple of questions raised. I'll help you walk through them.
Sure.
Very different topics, but I think a lot of them are very relevant to the teachers here. So allow me just to present some of the questions that we saw over chat. No? So there's this first question from Ms. Eloisa Bausas. No? She asked, would it ever be acceptable to allow students to grade themselves preliminarily, guided by the rubric, then compare it with the teacher's grades? Now, I know that you talked about some strategies of asking students to use the rubrics along the way and not just at the end or at the performance task. But I guess the idea here is it sound practice to have them grade themselves first?
Yeah. I think so. I think the power of self-assessment is great, and that's a practice that's very, very common in our school. And in fact, we find that the kids are often, when it's clear to them, when they have the exemplars, they've been given feedback, they're actually harder on themselves than the teacher sometimes, or harder on each other sometimes. No? So I'll just share a screen for a short while here. This is an example of that. It's a bit small, but this is an example of having the student grade herself, because we're an all-girls school, so herself. So here it's, I got it, I mostly got it, and I need more practice. So since this is primary, they just have to check which one they feel they're at. But yes, I think that's a really good practice to do. Of course, it can't count as a final grade, but as she said in her question, to compare what they're thinking.
That's interesting. And I think that in terms of efficiency, even like if students, if you find that students are able to accurately grade themselves, it actually saves the teacher some time. I mean, not that the teacher need not do the evaluation, but it already gives a sense to the teacher as to what grade the particular work deserves, already based on their own self-evaluation.
Yeah. And one thing we find is that once students are used to this, they will look for the rubric. They will demand the rubric. They will say, "Sir, wala pang rubric," because they need it, because it's such an important guide for them. So they can't work without it, because it really tells them what the expectations are.
That's a very interesting insight. And maybe I'll just ask a question related to that first. I know that in your school, you've been using rubrics across the board, so to speak, right? Even for your youngest learners. No? So what was the transition like to get them used to this habit? Because your examples are great, but let's say for schools and for teachers who have not been doing the practices that you shared with us today, how does it look like from the learner's perspective? How do you get them there to what you mentioned, that they're now looking for the rubrics, they're demanding for the rubrics from their teachers now?
Yeah, well, I think the answer there is really, I guess, two things. One is using it many times throughout the unit. So if they're not used to it, then it can be in a very low stakes way, right? Like it can maybe have no bearing on their grade yet. It can be at the start, wala pang justification or anything, just like maybe a checklist. Like a checklist is a really good place to start, where you put the descriptors and turn them into a checklist and say, did you do this, 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 this? That's pretty low impact and easy to do, right? And then just time, I think, for us, because there was no, like, we didn't consciously have any strategies to transition or anything. I think it's just that over time, the kids just got used to it, and it just became part of how they work. So time, I think, is the answer.
So time and practice and just
Yeah.
sticking to the habit of doing it
And
build.
experimenting, I think, the other thing, no, like teachers being reflective, so they try something and then they reflect, did it work, did it not work? If it didn't work, again, we'll do it another way. So yeah.
Sige. So speaking of experimenting, there's this interesting question here from Julio Ortiz. His question is it okay if we involve the students in constructing the rubrics for the performance task? Have you had any experience in your school of something like that?
I would say that if you read the literature about rubrics, that is actually one of the best practices to involve students in making rubrics. If you can do that at the very start of the unit, that's great. I wouldn't do it right before the performance task kasi too late na yun, diba? But if you do it at the start, and that's in fact the way you build your unit, that's great. In our school, we don't, because it's just a time issue. Purely because it's a time issue. But it is a best practice if you read a lot of the literature about it. So yes, I would highly recommend it if you can do that.
Parang that's a next level of their agency, that they're not just being evaluated based on rubrics and knowing how to use the rubrics, but they now get to be involved in the actual making of the rubrics. No?
And what they're doing there is, together with the teacher, they're thinking of, okay, in real life, not because of our grade, but in real life, what makes a good whatever, right? What makes a good explanation? Yeah.
Thanks. I'll just ask another question, also asked by Julio Ortiz earlier. And this is an interesting question because, of course, when we teach classes, they're not a homogeneous group, right? You have some students who excel a lot, some average students. And the question here is, would you need separate rubrics for different kinds of students or students from different proficiency levels? Or is the best practice just having one rubric that will apply to everyone?
I think the answer to that depends really on your school. Like, for example, in our school, we're a traditional school, so we can't adjust standards, right? We really set out a standard and say this is proficiency, and you have to meet that in order to get this particular grade. But I would imagine that maybe in some progressive schools, that might be a practice that they would do, no? But what I would suggest is this, kasi Sir Julio is right, no? Students have many different levels. So one thing I would do is never set the highest standard at what the best child can do, because often that child is performing far above grade level. Right? So if you set the highest standard in grade 5 based on the best kid's work, and pala that kid is performing at like grade 7 level, that's really unfair, right? So you have to make sure that you're setting it according to targets and not according to best students' work. The other thing, this was so powerful. This was given to me by, this tip was given to me by a teaching coach who visited our school. And she actually uses a different rubric throughout the year and throughout the quarter even. So at the start of the quarter, it's easier. And then as the year or the quarter progresses, the standard gets higher and higher. So for example, yung perfect mo at the start of the unit, pwedeng by the end of the unit, yun na yung second from perfect.
Right.
Because they had time to develop already, right? Or baka two bands, like in the example I gave, diba, it was write a sentence about a character. Baka at the start of the unit, perfect na yun. Basta write a correct sentence about the character. Then maybe by the end of the quarter, that's when the details come in, or maybe later in the year, and then you can build the rubric up as they progress.
That's a great idea, no? And I think that reading into Sir Julio's question here, I think that this really comes from a very common paradigm about grading that a lot of us have. whether we admit it or not, at least subconsciously, a lot of us have a normative paradigm of grading, right? Like we feel like grades are supposed to tell who is better than the others. But then I guess from your perspective, it's a very different paradigm, right? That we're talking about grading here, not to rank students against each other, but to give feedback to students in relation to the targets that you've set. And I think that's a shift in mindset for a lot of us because we've been so used to grades being basis for who is better than the other, who is best, right?
And if I can add, no, the other thing that's why exemplars from previous years or teacher made exemplars are great. Kasi you make them based on the targets. Hindi siya based on students' work now. So it's more, you can ensure that it's more developmentally appropriate. Also to remember that there are lots of different ways that a perfect piece of work can look like, right? There are lots of different ways that, And the other, I'll just add to his question now. While we in our school don't differentiate rubrics, you can differentiate scaffolds so that you can add more, right? So maybe some kids don't need a word bank, but others do. Some kids don't need a graphic organizer, but others do. So the scaffolding, I think, is where a lot of the differentiation can take place. Or maybe they need like more intensive individual coaching sessions or something like that.
Thanks. I think this is quite affirming to one of the things I tried myself in my class was in one of my assessments last semester, I allowed them to resubmit. So I give them a grade based on a rubric with very clear feedback. Some of them getting really low grades because they really didn't do enough. But I allowed them to resubmit, no? And a lot of them actually ended up with A's because when they resubmitted, of course, they already addressed the feedback. So in cases like that, do you feel like it's fair? Does it sound fair given that you allow them to resubmit after giving the feedback?
For online learning, so this was a big change that we made in assessment in our school for online learning because we knew that, okay, we might not be able to provide exactly the same kind of teaching and instruction that we did face-to-face, where before, kung bagsak ka, confident kami na we did everything we could. We really, but here online, we were saying, okay, how can we make sure that the kids really have every opportunity that we can? So we've actually built in revisions into our assessment process. So yes, everybody can revise. And so we're doing the same thing. Yeah.
Thanks. So I'll ask another question here from Ruben Rodriguez. So we've been talking about rubrics as used in grading, giving feedback between the teacher and the students. But the question here is about the use of rubrics for student-to-student feedback. Do you think it's a good idea for learners to also be allowed to use some rubrics to rate themselves, rate each other? I guess in a way, maybe we can situate this to group projects and group work. And in these cases, do you think they would be able to judge fairly, or would it be too subjective?
I guess, well, I have a two-part answer to that. For students giving each other feedback, not in a group work setting. So just in a peer feedbacking way, where, exchange work lang and give each other feedback. That is a 100% yes for me. They can rate each other, as the examples here showed. Sometimes they give each other really good feedback if it's a good rubric. And if I would recommend that the teacher give them sentence stems, para hindi naman masyadong brutal, because they can be really brutal with each other, so they need some coaching there with language. For peer ratings within groups, I would say be a little bit more careful. I would maybe not use that as the final grade. I would maybe allow it to inform the teacher's grade a little bit, but have to be conscious na baka galit lang, or, there's always that danger that there might be some personal biases in there. So yeah, I'd be a little bit cautious about using it in for group works. I wouldn't say no, but I think the kids would have to be really prepared.
Right. So in a sense, we have to be aware of the possible subjectivity that could be involved in the feedback that they give. Since they're not necessarily teachers, I mean, they're not necessarily thinking the way we're thinking when we're designing and evaluating using rubrics.
And I think kasi when they're peer assessing and it's individual work, then the peer has no investment in your. I mean,
Right,
no personal feeling for your work. I'm just gonna give you feedback. But when it's group, that's everybody's grade, and they all had to do the same work, and somebody might not have done as
Right.
much. Yeah. So.
Okay. So I'll ask one of the questions that came to mind as I was listening to you. One of the things that struck me was one of your first points of designing rubrics based on goals. Because I like that thinking that I think that a lot of us, our practice is we think of an assessment and then we think of rubrics on how to grade the assessment. No? And I think it's very valuable to think about how to start with the goals and then draw the rubrics from the goals. No? Would you mind just expounding a little bit on what's the thinking process behind that? So when I look at my goals, what do I look at or what do I look for to convert it to the rubrics that I want to make?
So, well, first I'll be honest. No, I do that, but sometimes I also don't. Like for me, it's more of a fluid process. Like sometimes I'll start with learning goals, sometimes I'll start with the assessment, but there's always a back and forth to check to make sure. But one really big thing that we did in our school this year was we made all of our rubrics at the start of the year, based on the learning goals. So I would say that sometimes, let me just share
Sure.
screen here. Okay. So sometimes it can be a pretty straightforward process. Like here, it's really just taking the actual language from the learning goal and putting it into the descriptor, and then usually adding some adjectives or qualifiers, right? So it's here the goal is write some words, a phrase or a sentence about a character. So I isolated it to character kasi hindi naman pwedeng yung buong goal, di ba? Especially for the second one, you can't make a descriptor for this entire thing, right? So one thing I do is usually break it up into parts. And then the other thing is adding descriptors. So for example, writing a sentence or phrase that correctly describes a character, or for more like in higher grades, it might be vivid, maybe not vivid, but like, you might add things like insightfully or thoroughly or things like that. No? And then I added lang the one more detail because I would try to push for elaboration. So it's starting with the language of the goal and then adding your descriptors, and also figuring out how you want to break up the goals. Not just in the rubric, but even throughout the lesson and stuff, right? Because you don't take them all together. So if you notice in this example, theme is completely absent, right? I figured, okay, that seems like too much to do in one lesson or unit, so maybe that happens in another one. So does that?
Yes. Thank you. I ask that because I think that even in our trainings at SALT, one of the challenges that we often observe is that whole starting part of the start, how to start building your rubric. No? And I know that you should begin by thinking of the criteria that you want to put there, but thinking of the criteria is easier said than done. So I think this scaffold is helpful, like looking at, as you mentioned in your example, looking at the verbs that you put in the objectives, looking at the criteria that you put there.
I guess just to add really quickly, one thing, another thing that helps is asking, okay, like in real life, what's the criteria for this, right? So here, it says investigate. So I guess that would translate to an explanation of some kind, right? So that's why this became explanation. So figuring out, okay, what makes a good scientific explanation, right? So I'm not a science teacher, so I just put correct and thorough, but maybe a science teacher has other things they're looking for. So that would be my start.
Thanks. That's helpful. Okay, so I'll now move on to a set of questions related to feedback, the last part of the presentation. So the first question here comes from Nina Estrella. Her question is, how do you give feedback so that our students will not get offended? So in a very Asian Filipino culture, though, but we're very careful with our words, or how to correct them without making their self-esteem and self-confidence low, or affecting their own self-confidence. What did you have to say on that?
Okay, sorry, I'm just scrolling down through my slides. There's one particular one that might be helpful here. Okay. So I personally find sentence stems very helpful. As I said, especially when you're tired, you're checking at 9 o'clock at night, you're sleepy already. Sometimes you forget to be kind. So you might want to copy this site down here, because this is actually a longer list with a lot of sentence stems. So you'll see here that the sentence stems here are very kind, right? So one suggestion would be you can consider changing. Maybe you can add. For me, we were given these two phrases in a training, and they have become my magic words for everything when you want to be kind about feedback. And they are, I noticed that, and I wonder if. So even if you forget everything else from this list of prompts, if you just use I wonder if and I notice that, I think that makes you kinder when you give the feedback. And then protocols. Protocols are also very powerful here. Glows and grows, 2 stars and a wish, because they ensure that you're not just giving negatives, you're also giving positives. So these protocols just keep you in check and make sure that you're doing both. Interestingly, I've actually had teachers who initially, frame feedback as criticism. So that was such an important thing for me to correct and say, okay, don't teach them to accept criticism, teach them to accept feedback, and make sure that you're giving feedback for the good things as well as the areas to work on.
Thank you. So I noticed that. I wonder if, I think that's a very helpful frame. Most especially, I noticed that because I noticed that as a STEM really forces you to look at the work and not use language that talks about the person giving the work, right? Like it forces you to really identify parts of the work that you want to comment on. And I think sometimes, inadmittedly, because of the many students that we have, the number of papers we need to check, the number of projects we need to look through, diba? Para sometimes it does get in the way. So yes, but going back to some of those cues would be helpful.
And I would say that if there are administrators present here who check teacher work, these stems are also really good for when you give feedback to your teachers, because, we can also be really harsh when we give teachers feedback. So these are just as applicable to that situation.
Right. To build on what you just mentioned, there's actually a question about that from Evangeline Nakilya. Her question is, how might teachers stay affirmative whenever feedback is shared to them by students during their online sessions? For them not to be too emotional, not to be irritated. So I guess this question is more on the teacher's end, right? We've been talking about feedback from the students' end, but let's say students give feedback to teachers, or let's say they didn't like their grade. I don't know. They didn't like how they were graded and things like that. So, what usually helps to, as a teacher, what usually helps for us to frame viewing that and listening to that, so that we can really listen and not necessarily get offended or react to it?
Well, I guess the first part of my answer would be, personally, I just always feel bad. Because you put so much of your heart and soul into what you're doing. So of course, when a student doesn't receive it so well, I think you also owe it to yourself to give yourself the space to feel sad or feel bad or whatever. No? But of course, you have to move past that, right? So one thing I would recommend is you can Google growth mindset statements. And so I don't know, I'm sure many of you have heard of growth mindset, no? And by Carol Dweck. It's a concept that she created, and it's something that many schools have started to become interested in. And growth mindset language helps you frame these mistakes or failures or times when you didn't do as well as you want in a positive way, right? So it helps you see mistakes as opportunities to learn rather than, just plain mistakes and failures. So I would encourage, Google growth mindset statements, and they have actual language that you can use with yourself to reframe, negative feedback.
So kahit tayo, no? So we need we need to form ourselves
and
to.
it takes practice, because like I said, I mean, I've given talks about growth mindset, but syempre when you receive the feedback yourself, right? So yeah.
Sige. I have one last question, and this came to mind while listening to you this morning. A lot of what you mentioned about feedback, about rubrics, using rubrics, continuing to use rubrics throughout the learning experience. There's something that came to mind that might be relevant also to a lot of us who have been teaching, probably because of some previous notion about teaching and testing and evaluating. That would doing all of these things feel like you're teaching to the test? Some of us are so used to this notion that performance tests, they're evaluative in nature, right? So, and maybe that's where a lot of people are coming from when you were mentioned a while ago that sometimes it's a mystery how we grade because it's coming from that stance that no, show me what you got and then I will make a judgment on what you got, right? So does it feel like teaching to the test? What's your take on that?
That's actually, I think, a really common question for this topic. So sorry, let me just pull up a slide here and to illustrate. So it's really common. But what I would say is that teaching to the test is bad if your test is not authentic, I guess, right? So like if it's objective and okay, every day we're going to practice the answers to these 50 questions, and then you're going to be ready when I give you the test and choose 30 of them. That's obviously really bad, right? But here, if you look at the descriptors, they're actually the learning targets, right? So yes, in a way you are teaching to the rubric, but your rubric is the learning targets, right? So you are teaching directly to your learning targets in a very explicit way. So I would say it depends on the rubric. If your rubric is aligned really well to the learning goals and you are using the criteria that is used in the real world to judge these skills, then I'd say you are in a way teaching to the rubric, but that means you're teaching to your learning goals and to real life standards. On the other hand, if your rubric is not the highest quality rubric, then if it's I don't know, if it's not very aligned, then it might not be a positive.
Thanks, Kara. I think that this is one of the shifts that we need to remind ourselves of as we embark on this. Again, recognizing that we've been used to a lot of practices, and some of these tips that you shared with us this morning really challenge some of those defaults, right? The defaults that we tend to as teachers, as learners before, right? And it does take some time for us. So teachers, don't be too hard on yourselves too.
Yeah, no. I would always say just start with one thing, start with something that's very low stakes. And always just be, I would say always never be judgmental about yourself. It's my big thing as a teacher.
All right. Thanks, Kara. Thanks for answering all of those questions. I know there were a lot.
Thank you.
And hopefully those who are watching us today we were able to really think about their own practices as they listen to you. So maybe before we just close this portion, is there anything that you'd like to, maybe just one reminder, one big tip that you'd like to leave with the teachers who are watching us today?
Well, I guess, given what you were saying about, this being mindset, like a lot of mindset changing required and all. And just, we're all under such new circumstances with online learning and distance learning. In some places, it's modular learning. I guess the thing I would leave is not actually related to this talk, but just to continue experimenting and continue being kind to yourself, because anytime we're doing new things, we're bound to fail, we're bound to make mistakes, but that's okay. And so just, give yourself a lot of space to not be perfect and to not feel as competent as you used to feel when you were face to face.
Thank you so much, Kara. So if you're tuned in, let's give Kara a virtual emoji for our feedback for her today's session. Thank you so much.
Thank
So
you so much also for
thank you
having
very
me.
much. I personally learned a lot, and I'm sure that our participants learned a lot as well. Maybe just to put things to a close, allow me to share the three words that I captured from your session. Oh, this is some feedback giving also. But the three words that are really coming from the three key ideas that I think Kara reinforced for us this morning. The first is alignment. No? So sabi niya, tuhog-tuhog. No? That I think if you want to foster learner agency, one of the things that was reminded of us today is to make the goals transparent to students and make the rubrics aligned to those goals. No? Because if the goals are transparent to students, if they know where they're headed and they see that the rubrics are helping them head there, then they would feel that they could be involved in this process. So that's my first takeaway. My second takeaway was about clarity, the second segment of Kara's talk, that it's not enough to design rubrics. We have to make an effort to make sure that we understand the rubrics the same way our students understand it, and they actually know how to use the rubrics. No? Because I think that's rubrics are not new. You mentioned earlier that a lot of us here are probably using some form of rubrics, but we've been using it for grading. It's been hidden in that segment, in that part of our syllabus where we describe the assessments and how we will grade them. But to bring it out and to make it present in the learning experience was really a key idea that I took away with me today. And finally, about feedback, that the rubrics, the feedback, when you base it on the rubric, can be productive and can be something that learners can actually act upon. No? And I think this is a great reminder for all of us. And I'm glad that you brought up that, most especially in distance learning, wherein, to be honest, the distance really hinders our ability to literally and figuratively sometimes reach out to every student. So the more we know about where students are, the better. And the more we know as to how we can reach out to them more. So thank you, Kara, for these
Thank
thoughts
you
this
also.
morning. Thank you very much for spending your Saturday morning with us. And I also, on behalf of Rex Education and the SALT Institute, I also want to thank our audience this morning. Thank you so much for spending your Saturday with us, thinking about rubrics on a Saturday morning. And I think at the end of the day, we're here because of our students and for our students. And I think that no matter whether you're teaching in preschool or higher education, this is something we all have in common. That at the heart of it is this common interest and passion for helping our learners become successful wherever they are. So just a reminder before we close, the recording of the video for today's session will be found on the Rex Bookstore's Facebook page and on the SALT Institute's Facebook page. So if you want to share this with your colleagues for them to actually listen to and watch again, or watch us, if you picked up some things here that you'd like to share with them, feel free to share with them those pages so that they can have access to the recording of today's session. And as a reminder, our webinar series will continue next week. No? So next Saturday's talk will be on the topic of the role of beliefs in student agency, to be given by Dr. Maita Ladrido. So hopefully, if you enjoyed today's session, if you picked up some nuggets from today's conversation, you join us for another set of engaging conversations next Saturday. So thank you very much, Kara. Thank you very much to everyone who tuned in today. Have a good weekend. And as Kara mentioned, take care of yourselves too. Take it easy. Give yourselves a break so that you can recharge and do your best on Monday again, as we always do. Maraming salamat and have a good weekend, everyone. Thank you.